Well, thank you all again for coming out tonight. This is our last of 4 speaker series presentations this summer, and looking forward to talking to you about agency blacksmiths. It's blacksmithing is a topic that anywhere you go in history, any living history museums, any books, anything like that, blacksmiths are going to take a sort of prominent role. But what's interesting about agency blacksmiths is there's not a lot written about them. There's not a lot even studied about them. So it's a unique subset within this whole sphere of blacksmithing that I think is very unique. It has a very strong connection to our site here, as most of you know. So looking forward to going into some of the details. So to get you guys back into the time we're talking about, I'm going to start with a story that Juliet Kinsey tells. In her memoir called Waban, she talks about how after the Black Hawk War ended, which if you're not familiar with the war, the Black Hawk War started in the summer of 1832, and it involved the Sauk tribe in Illinois. Black Hawk was a Sauk leader who got into a war with the federal government and came up through Wisconsin. That move was likely partly a military strategic move intended to get the Ho-Chunk to join with him. The Ho-Chunk had a sort of a falling out with the government in 1827. This is only about 5 years later. So there's good reason to believe that the Ho-Chunk are going to be at least willing to sympathize, if not outright join Black Hawk in fighting against the government. But that didn't happen. The nation at large stayed neutral. John Kinsey had an emergency council right here behind me with the Ho-Chunk Nation as soon as this war broke out. And he, as well as many of the tribe's leaders, sort of lobbied and worked with the people within the tribe to maintain neutrality. However, some Ho-Chunk men did join Black Hawk, especially down in the Rock River region. The Rock River region had been the most sort of unsettled area during the Redbird Uprising of 1827, and now again it was the one that was of the most concern because of its proximity with the Sauk tribe in Illinois and the provocations that were going on with the lead mining district down there. So it ended up that a few Ho-Chunk men did join Black Hawk. Well, after the war was over, the government realized this, and they told the tribe that to ensure peaceful relationships with the federal government, they had to surrender these people who had joined Black Hawk. So during that fall, White Crow, one of the main leaders of the Ho-Chunk Nation down near Lake Koshkonong, Fort Atkinson area, he brought up about, I believe, 6 men who had joined Black Hawk. On the front porch of the agency, those 6 men were surrendered to the government. It was a time that was very difficult for White Crow, who had been a major leader of the tribe for quite a few years, and he during this time, Juliet recalled, he actually surrendered his his leadership and passed it on to his son. This was a very difficult thing for him to do. The young men who had been surrendered were imprisoned in Fort Winnebago, just across the river from here. They were put in what was called the Black Hole. The Black Hole, and as the military called it, was essentially a dugout dirt basement underneath one of the fort barracks. It was a place where, after the Redbird Uprising in 1827, sort of some correlations here, Redbird, who had led the uprising, was taken to a similar place. It was a very nasty environment to be living in for any extended time. So Redbird actually died in prison. So these guys who are now in Fort Winnebago in this black hole, they were really considering what their future was going to be. The government insisted on holding official trials, going by the white system of justice. So they knew it could be a while before they would even get to trial to potentially get out of there. So they decided to pay attention to how these guards who were watching this place were going about their business, and they found out that they could use some of their time and use their knives, which apparently they had kept with them, and start digging out from under the fort wall. I don't know how long they were with working at this, but pretty soon they had dug out from under the fort and popped up about 6 to 10 feet outside the fort wall. They beat feet out of there, and all of a sudden John and Juliet were eating breakfast in the room back here in the dining room of the agency house, and Lieutenant Davies came in, and he was rushed in and announced the prisoners had escaped. So John quickly went over to the trading post just down the way here, and he held an emergency council with the Ho-Chunk leaders who were there, and he said, you guys got to help us get these prisoners back. And they said, we gave them to you once. If you want them, go find them. So they decided that wasn't the way to do things. They had not had much luck during the Black Hawk War and that, so they just let it go at that. But something was calling these escaped prisoners back here. It was getting toward late fall. The winter was coming on, and winter to the Ho-Chunk meant the time when you go out, trap your furs, and that's the time when you make your money for the year. That's the time when they get the furs that are going to be purchasing the supplies, the materials they needed to survive the following year. However, the previous year had been pretty hard on their traps, their guns, and their equipment. They needed to have that fixed. So the only place to do that was at the agency blacksmith. So Juliet says that they were again eating breakfast in the dining room back here, and how all of a sudden 3 men came in the front door, appeared in the dining room door. 2 of the Ho-Chunk men went out this side door, came out here, but the third one stayed in that doorway and began telling John what needed to be done with his traps, the things he needed fixed by the blacksmith. So John would normally translate that, put it on a piece of paper, attach it to the trap, the implement that needed fixing, and send him over to the blacksmith. Well, John sort of had his back to this person who he was talking to, but Juliet was looking straight at him, and she immediately recognized that he was one of these escaped prisoners. So she sort of covertly relayed that to John, and he said, well, okay, just don't give him any indication that you know who he is. So John finished translating his order for the blacksmith and sent him over. And I guess Juliet says he later explained to the family that he thought these Ho-Chunk men weren't as guilty as they were said to be, but in reality it's probably just code word for I don't have a cell phone to call the fort. So anyway, that anecdote just sort of shows how the blacksmiths here were a very important thing for the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was something that would even make a person who would risk imprisonment come here because it had become an important thing. So we're going to talk today about a little bit what made this a significant addition to the agency here and some of the details of how it functioned. So, what's an agency blacksmith? He was, first of all, a federally employed craftsman. The Indian agencies were all subject to the oversight of the United States President. It was overseen through the War Department, so it didn't have any localized, state, territorial, any local oversight. It was a blacksmith who repaired tribal hardware. As we'll see, some of what the government intended for this being repaired was not actually what was getting repaired. What the natives really needed repaired were, again, things like their traps, their knives, their axes that they would use to cut trees, cut brush, cut firewood. They had steel bits in them. And sometimes those bits might get worn down from resharpening. So you'd come here and get them fixed up. So who, what, now we're at when. These blacksmiths were usually established right after a treaty. The government's mode of operating with any nation around the country was through treaties which would, whether it was to maintain relationships, to purchase land, after a war to establish peace. These treaties often also ended up establishing these blacksmiths. So where? At established Indian agencies. They had to be overseen by an agent, of course. So we had one here. There were, I believe, 3, actually 4 in Wisconsin. Many throughout the United States, all the way down, into Georgia, out to Missouri. Pretty big span for where these agencies and blacksmiths were located. But the big thing that makes blacksmiths who served agencies important to study is the why of why they were established here. They were often established as payments for land or for favors. It was, in the government's eyes, a physical representation of the payment the government gave for land. It was the physical representation of the honor the government would give to a tribe that agreed to go along with its policies. To the natives, it was the why of blacksmiths was a little different. The government was willing to establish these, but the natives also were very interested in getting these established for their tribes. And this was because we're at a time when the fur trade is ending. In Wisconsin, by the 1820s, the fur trade was pretty much ended. The beavers, the muskrats, the fur-bearing animals had been essentially trapped out. Along the Fox River, Wisconsin River, down into the Rock River, there was still some significant trading going on up north. But overall, the purchasing power of the tribe had been very greatly diminished. You were no longer able to purchase the knives, purchase the blankets, purchase the things that were by now required for daily life. So these blacksmiths stepped in as a place where instead of having to get go and get furs, hunt in an increasingly difficult situation, now you're able to go to the blacksmith and get what you have repaired, so you don't have to buy more. So it was important to the natives in a little bit different way than it was important to the government. So some of the brief history of our blacksmith shop here. This blacksmith was established in the Treaty of 1829. Before this time, the Ho-Chunk Nation had never given up any land. The Redbird Uprising, which I referenced earlier, resulted in the government making the commitment that either the lead miners who were encroaching on native lands down in the southwest part of the state, either these lead miners or the Ho-Chunk had to get out of the lead district. Having them both in the same region was, they considered to be a recipe for future conflict. So in 1829, a treaty was held where the Ho-Chunk Nation were essentially not allowed to leave the treaty ground until this treaty was signed. They ended up selling all their land south of the Wisconsin River and west of the Four Lakes, which is modern-day Madison, for about $18,000 in silver every year for the subsequent 30 years, plus various trade goods and blacksmithing services. The tribe was very scattered across Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk territory went all the way up to the Black River, down to the Mid-Rock River, all the way out to Lake Winnebago and even up at the north end of it. So you had a pretty big geographic population to serve. So three blacksmiths were established. One in Prairie du Chien, one here at Fort Winnebago, and one down on the Rock River, one of its tributaries called the Sugar River, near Albany, Wisconsin. So these blacksmiths were established in 1829. So by the time the treaty got ratified in early 1830, the government needed to start implementing its payment. So John Kinsey, who was established as a new agent here, had decided he was going to go east and marry Juliet. He was not able to come out here right away, so I assume that on his way through here, don't have the exact details because they haven't been found yet or they're not recorded, but he established a relationship with a blacksmith who appears to have been an independent individual at the portage, and worked out a relationship in which he would rent his shop for serving the Ho-Chunk Nation. There was a little bit of difficulty while researching this to understand why, when John and Juliet got here in 1830, there was already a blacksmith established down toward Highway 33. Down, she says it's down at the bottom of the hill. And as you'll see in a bit, they turned around essentially the next year and established a new blacksmith up at the top of the hill. So why did they put all the effort into building this separate blacksmith? But then we found some information in one of John's ledgers from the year from 1829 to 1830, where he pays somebody for the rent of his blacksmith shop. So in Juliet Kinsey's painting of Fort Winnebago, which is over there, the agency over here, she shows this building down here, which, based on her descriptions, is this temporary blacksmith shop. So in 1831, a new blacksmith shop was built that was this time under federal control. It was built by the federal government and would now have a blacksmith who was not rented. He was here to stay. So $500 contract was awarded to R&A J. Irwin, which was a group up in Green Bay, which built this blacksmith shop here. This picture, which you saw in the initial slide, was drawn by Mr. Ridgway. He drew it in 1898, I believe. He was working on, going around to where these different sites were, walking the grounds, also talking to the early settlers. So he draws this blacksmith shop up here at the top of the hill. So whereas this is the rented blacksmith shop in one of the early maps, here's the permanent one up here. As an interesting side note, the Irwins lost quite a bit of money building the shop here. In Frontier, Wisconsin, there were some businessmen who made a living out of fulfilling government contracts, and Irwin was one of those. And when you were doing these contracts, you did not have, the manpower, you didn't have the materials right on site with you to do the project. So the Irwins would establish a contract and then go try to find the people, the materials to get the job done. And when you're building a blacksmith shop in a place so remote from the two areas of settlement in Wisconsin, up in Green Bay and Prairie du Chien, when you're doing it at such a remote area, it's pretty easy to underestimate the cost. So they ended up losing about $200, which is about, pretty close to half of what they had initially thought the project would cost. They built both the blacksmith shop and the agency house, or the temporary agency house, which was eventually became the blacksmith's house. So the process here, went into that a little bit with the story I mentioned earlier, but this was essentially a one-stop shop, not just the blacksmith shop, but it was a place where, this whole hillside was a place where that would become an important part in the Ho-Chunk yearly routine. You could come here to trade, the trading post just down there, operated by Pierre Paquette. You could come here, have your traps fixed by a blacksmith. You can see in this part of Juliet's picture here that she draws Ho-Chunk chipotekes or wigwams set up right outside the shop, so they could stay overnight, have their things fixed. This is also a place of information and a place where the nation's concerns could be discussed. So this was essentially a place where when you came here, you got a lot of things done, and then you could move on with your yearly routine. To get your things fixed, you had to have translation. The blacksmith here did not know Ho-Chunk. There was one blacksmith here who was half Menominee, but Menominee and most of the your trade Indian languages here were Ojibwa, or related ones, Algonquin languages, which were completely different from the Siouan language Ho-Chunk. So the blacksmiths usually did not know the language, so the Indian agent here took a bigger part in the process. Apparently they would come to the agency house and meet with John. He would put together those paper tags with their information on it, attach them to the traps or guns, whatever they needed fixed, and then he would send them over to the blacksmith. In this process, we don't know if the agent then had a little bit of control over who got what fixed, whether there was a limit on how much you could get fixed on any given year. So the agent took a larger part than you might expect in the blacksmithing sort of routine, but there's still some unanswered questions on that. Again, complimentary or permission-based? Was it just a given that you could come here and get whatever you wanted fixed, or did the agent have to give you that permission? So the blacksmith ended here about 1840. So the blacksmith operated for only about 10 years. It was never really meant to be a very permanent thing. The government had a very good idea by the time even the Treaty of 1829 came out, that eventually, whether it be 5 or 10 years down the road, the Ho-Chunk would no longer be in Wisconsin. This was at the time of the overall, it was called the Indian removal, overseen by Andrew Jackson, who brought it to its logical conclusion, where he argued that all Native Americans should be moved west of the Mississippi. So it was known right when this blacksmith was built that eventually this blacksmith would be moved. And as it turned out, it became both the carrot and the stick of forced removal. It was an incentive for the Ho-Chunk to move. It was seen already in 1832 that when the Ho-Chunk would be moving out of Wisconsin across the Mississippi, it would never be a permanent situation unless the blacksmith moved with them, or preferably moved before they moved. So they believed that they needed to move the blacksmith early on so that removal could stay. And it also, at this time, since the blacksmith became such an integral part of the yearly routine, the yearly getting your things fixed, it was an essential business here. If you moved it over across the Mississippi, the Ho-Chunk were in a bad position to stay on in Wisconsin. So it became both the incentive and sort of the threat of removal. It was moved to the Turkey River, which it's not clearly marked in this map, but it was in the neutral ground between the Dakota tribe and I believe the Sauk tribe down to the south. So the Ho-Chunk were forced to remove over to this area, and the blacksmith moved with them in about 1839 to 1840. So who were these smiths? If you were living here in the 1830s, who would be considered eligible to be a smith? Well, they had some specific qualifications. Albert Herring, who was the Secretary of War in 1833, said that you need to appoint a good workman who is sober, moral, industrious, sort of the traits which were considered most essential in your proper Eastern society. Let him be an exemplary man, and if possible, one acquainted with those Indians. Fix his compensation at, of course, as moderate a rate as possible. Take into view his duties and how desirable it is to ensure that the services of a competent man. So that brings the question, why is smithing skill sort of almost seeming secondary to character traits? Why are character traits so important in the decision of who to get here as a smith? And like I said here, it's not a rhetorical question. The answer is pretty important to understanding why these smiths were established in the bigger picture, and why the government was so interested in getting the Smiths established. Well, locally, these Smiths were, whenever you're more, in a boots on the ground situation, you look at more of the practical aspects of it. John Kinsey would look, it appears from his writings, looked at the blacksmith as a place, logistically, from the perspective of repairing the traditional goods of the native tribe, being the practical place to repair the items connected with the traditional way of life to those tribes. But nationally, Indian Bureau planners, which this is Thomas McKenney, who was considered the father of American Indian policy. He and others saw more ambitious aims in this. Well, they saw agency Smiths as an integral part of the process of civilizing the tribes. This was controversial, but a very consistent part of the government's proposal in dealing with the natives. They saw a need to change the tribes into their view of what a proper person should be. The character traits which are emphasized in here are part of that, creating that image of what a civilized person should look like. He's this person who the government wants to be sort of the upstanding individual who the tribe can look up to and hopefully eventually change themselves into his image. They knew that, in a more practical sense, the tribes were getting the wrong message from what you might call the border ruffians. People selling alcohol to the tribes, people, running the natives off their land as, settlers came in with the attitude that, they had won independence from Britain. This was now their land. How does anybody have the right to live on what's their manifest destiny? So they wanted somebody who was, temperate, who could be a good representative. So their solution was, men of character and, sometimes outright virtue pageantry. Especially in terms of, an example of this is the government's view of having to go through the process of civil trials for all Native Americans. If a Native American commits a crime, rather than forming a practical solution based on what the tribe saw as the right thing to do for punishing them, they insisted on all the natives they could into these official European-style trials and showing them the disinterested justice of the American system. This was also seen as blacksmiths were also seen as a logical step in the process of making agriculture feasible for the tribes. Part of this whole bigger picture of using these blacksmiths to civilize the tribes is using them to make agriculture easier. They saw agriculture as one of the stepping stones to becoming a proper civilized person along the lines of the Europeans. So without, blacksmithing services were key to European settlements, so we're going to establish these here, and even if they're serving the natives by, repairing their traditional items, eventually they'll be able to serve them in repairing their civilized items. Again, humanitarian aims, this whole issue was a very politically charged matter. If you were talking to somebody about the issue of Indian removal, the policy of the government toward the natives in the 1830s, it would always very likely come up in your conversation about the government's moral duty to the tribe, their duty to treat these people as an erring little brother who they could bring up alongside them and create into proper citizens. And there were people on both sides of the argument, people who believed that the natives had a very established way of life, a very a culture that they preferred, and those that saw that everything needed to be changed. So blacksmithing became caught up in the middle of this this whole issue. If you were a smith here, you would get paid about $300 to $400 per year. Again, fixes compensation as moderate a sum as you can, consistently with the important object of procuring a proper person. So, you know, the government's got a very it's tightened its belt quite a bit in the 1830s because Andrew Jackson was of the mindset that federal debt was not a good thing. He believed that it needed to be paid off. The government should not be running on any type of deficit. So money was not flowing very freely. So that's why you see the pay raising and falling from year to year, and that's why you see that there's a great emphasis on trying to keep that cost pretty low. Probably partly because of this, and partly because the frontier is a sort of not a real good place to permanently live at this time. You have very high turnover. The first smith here was, of course, that temporary smith that it appears that John paid. He essentially rented his services for the government. But the first permanent government-hired smith was Isidore Morin III. He was a Canadian-French man. He served from about 1830 to 1833. His striker, who was his assistant, which is the blacksmith here, had an assistant who was sort of serving an apprenticeship. His assistant was Augustine Pilon. His wife was actually the servant of the Kinseys, probably living in this house for a little while. But Morin left in 1833. He had married somebody up in Detroit that year, so it was very likely that he was now just going off to live with where she preferred to live. Next was William Jourdain. He was here from 1833 to 1834, about a year. He was French, part Menominee, and his striker was Joseph Desdenes, if I pronounced that right. Next came Leonard Groom. He was, I couldn't figure out his ancestry, but he was here from about 1834 to 1836, and he didn't leave on in a very good situation. He was very close to death by the time he left here. Just today when I was finalizing this, I found a story about a missionary who came to Fort Winnebago in 1836, and when he was here, he met this Leonard Groom, who he said was the blacksmith here, and he said that both Groom and himself were both at the Fort Winnebago Hospital, being overseen by the surgeon who was stationed at the surgeon's quarters. Groom, I believe, had some sort of respiratory issue. He had this missionary quickly baptize him because he was thinking he was headed out of here, and don't know quite what happened to him, but obviously he did leave here. His assistant was Hosea Russell, and he also left. So these strikers, it appears, were attached very strongly to the blacksmith themselves. So when you turn over between one blacksmith to another, you also are turning over to a different striker and a different assistant. Well, after him, we have Francis de Chocket and Francis Granger. De Chocket was Canadian-French, served from 1836 all the way through the end of the agency here, and even into the time when the agency was serving the Ho-Chunk down in Iowa. So he was the longest-lived agent here. But so overall, 4 different smiths here. Ethnicity is an interesting observation because if you look at this list, you see, Canadian-born, French, part Menominee. So you can see from this quote, the French were considered basically an important way to have an in with the tribe. The natives saw that the French had no interest in the land. They didn't really have very many permanent objectives in coming to Wisconsin other than to make money from the fur trade. They saw that the British were a little bit more of a threat. They saw these Yankee Americans coming in here as a threat to their land, a threat to their way of life. So they were understandably more friendly to the French. So whether John realized that and hired accordingly, I don't know. But that's a pretty common theme you see here at the agency. It could also just be a result of the fact that most of the laboring population of the frontier at this time was French. The materials. You got iron from Detroit. Again, you get suppliers who were making a living off of fulfilling government contracts. So we're not sure if the iron originated in Detroit. I would suspect that the United States at this time was not very industrial overall. We were still sort of an agrarian nation. So could have been very well within the possibility that this iron was actually coming from England or an overseas provider of some sort. Coal. Mississippi River Valley was an important place for getting coal at this time. Pretty much everybody who lived down in, say, St. Louis was getting coal, using that to heat their homes, to cook their meals, which was considered at that time a luxury for frontier life, but there were pretty substantial pockets of coal on the Mississippi. So it's very likely that the coal that came up here came from down towards St. Louis. Cost effectiveness was important when considering what you were going to burn in your forge. Coal was, again, it's pretty easily accessible to the agency here at Fort Winnebago, but it's a little bit harder to get all the way upstream to Fort Snelling up in Minnesota and what's now Minneapolis area. So up there the agency used charcoal. Both can be used for blacksmithing. Coal is the better of the two, but the Indian Bureau, again, is dealing with needing to cut costs where they can. So you see differences in supply chains between agencies. Another thing about supply chains that's a bit interesting is that in one of John Kinsey's ledgers, he lists Benjamin Kercheval as one of the iron suppliers. Kercheval was both an Indian agent and an iron supplier. So he had been an Indian agent a few years before up in the Detroit area. So after he retired from that position, it appears that that gave him a sort of a step up into being a supplier for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Watching and learning. The Ho-Chunk valuing this service, other tribes seeing the importance of blacksmithing, paid close attention as these blacksmiths were working. And if you're here for our event this past weekend, a lot of people like to just sit there and watch the blacksmith for half an hour. It's pretty neat to watch, but they were watching even closer than that. As you can see from this quote from Thomas Forsyth down in Rock Island, he was responding to some criticism of the blacksmith down in Rock Island. He says, "As respects Mr. Connor, the blacksmith at this place, the Indians' complaint is as follows. Early one morning, some time ago, some Indians went into the smith's shop and to talk about some work they wanted done. And not finding Mr. Connor, the blacksmith there, they commenced hammering a piece of iron on the anvil. They had been watching him so closely that they were not sure if they got his forge fired up or if they were just dry hammering this thing, but they were commencing to work. Mr. Connor was unwell. He could not eat breakfast, so he went to the shop when he wasn't feeling so good, and Dutchman-like, he was sulky and cross and said some angry words. The Indians observed the humor he was in, began to laugh, which made him the worse, and he cursed them, and from this originated the complaint." So, sort of humorous story, but again, these services are being very closely watched by the people who are getting the things fixed. So that brings us to the bigger picture of the Ho-Chunk and their blacksmiths. Something you see in the correspondence with John Kinsey is that he was always having some trouble with the blacksmith down on the Sugar River, down toward the Rock River, down just south of Madison. That blacksmith was established as being under John's jurisdiction, but nearby you had a different agent there, a sub-agent who was always competing with John. He wanted the annuity payment made down there. He was sort of cultivating the chiefs down there, trying to get a little bit more power down into his corner of the world. So there's a lot of complaints about the timing of when the blacksmith arrived there to work, about the quality of his work, and some of this may all come back to the fact that John may have made a bit of a mistake when he established where this agency would be. The Indian sub-agent's house down there was located within the mining district. This blacksmith was located way too far away for him to be overseen very closely. So there was nobody at the blacksmith shop to translate. There was nobody to oversee the work. So, when you have a blacksmith who does not speak Ho-Chunk, and where, John had found it necessary to translate for his blacksmith, the fact that this blacksmith down here was operating without any translation might just be the simple answer to why there were so many continual problems with this blacksmith. The other blacksmith for the Ho-Chunk down in Prairie du Chien was also a source of problems. The fur trader down there named Joseph Rolette wrote a complaint to the government. He was often at odds with Indian policy at the time, so he often filled his letters with a lot of complaints about the way the Indian Department was running its operations. So there could be some bias in here, but he mentions that the blacksmith down there, who Joseph Street had hired, had been boycotted by the Ho-Chunk. He said that he knew of instances where the Ho-Chunk would actually pay money to a private blacksmith to do their work rather than get their complimentary services at this blacksmith. One of the things that might have led to this was that whereas John Kinsey's agent here, or his blacksmith here, and the one down on the Sugar River, they were both French. Joseph Street's blacksmith was a Yankee American from Kentucky. So with the distrust between the Ho-Chunk and what they saw as the competitors for their land, it very well could be that it was just a difficult thing for the Ho-Chunk to be justifying going there and being served by somebody who was considered an unsavory individual to them. So that could have been why Joseph Street had problems. Again, translation was an important part of the Ho-Chunk and their blacksmithing. They had to get translation. So again, that's part of the problem with some of these previous blacksmiths. But in oral history, which is oral history is the way the Ho-Chunk remember those past times. When they reflect on this era of government services with blacksmithing, the oral history, at least on some of them, is that the benefit was not worth the cost. The views of blacksmithing overall sort of perceive it as something that yes, the Ho-Chunk needed it. Yes, it's something that was important, but it was just not important enough to offset what it had cost them. This was part of the payment for the land that they had given up, the land of their forefathers. So these blacksmiths are representative of what had been given up. So there's a logical question of these blacksmiths are serving the Ho-Chunk, but being a seasonal service for the Ho-Chunk, where they would incorporate it into a seasonal cycle, you have to wonder what were the blacksmiths doing the rest of the year? What was Joseph Street's blacksmith, who had been boycotted? What was he doing? Was he working for settlers? Was he building hardware for the fort? That's one of the unanswered questions here. Why so much raw material? The agency here received enough raw material to make several hundred brand new axe heads, which requires a fair amount of metal. So the blacksmith here was very well supplied. So was he making new items for the ho-chunk, or was he just serving a repair role? Blacksmithing versus gunsmithing versus tinsmithing versus all the above. Blacksmithing is just one component of smithing. There's different smiths who do different things. In St. Louis at the agency, they had different specialists who, they specialized in a given trade within the smithing, overall smithing trade. So they had multiple different smiths. But here in Portage, you had to have one person, based on budgetary limitations. You had to have one person who could do all of the above. And, I know some guys who can, they're very skilled in blacksmithing. They do many different types. So it was probably a matter of a lot of learning, but, the blacksmiths serving here were very young, if you look at when they were born. So the question is, were they really good at all the things they were supposed to be doing, or not? Another thing that is relevant to this is usually in the eyes of a person, living in the East, living anywhere where a blacksmith would be serving a European type population. A blacksmith equaled the farrier, equaled the horse doctor. He served all those functions together, because you need somebody who could do metalworking to make those horseshoes, and that guy might as well do everything all at once, take care of the horse's health. We don't know if that was happening here. The ho-chunk did not shoe their horses, so it's a question that, with the archaeology digs that we started these past couple of weeks, maybe we can get some answers from that in future years. I put this up here on the side here because it mentions the farrier, which is the blacksmith, the horse doctor, things like that. And horse doctors in those times, it's I think it would put some of your witch doctors to shame. They've got some pretty good concoctions here for healing your horse. So if your horse had a problem with hemorrhaging, so if it was getting all sorts of bruises as a result of a health ailment, here's one of their recipes. You'd take 1 ounce of Japan earth, which is sort of the rotted remnants of some type of tree that grows in India. I don't know why it's called Japan. It might have come through Japan on its way to the United States. 1 ounce of Irish slate. So you would get a rock imported from Europe, grind it up, put it in your medicine. 1 ounce gum juniper in fine powder, and 1 crab claw. You'd powder that all up, mix it together, mix in 3 gills of black beer, and if the disorder does not abate in 24 hours, repeat the dose. I have never had to give it a third time, but if needful, it may be done with safety. But if the weather is either very hot or cold, keep the horse in the house, because they can't deal with changes in weather. So it doesn't have anything to do with the agency blacksmiths, but I thought it was too good to pass up. Anyway, so as you could see from this previous slide, there are some remaining questions about what these smiths were doing. There's, again, not a lot written about these smiths, not a lot studied. So, who was served? Of course, they were serving the Ho-Chunk Nation, but who were they primarily serving? Was the Ho-Chunk Nation, being served just as a side, or was it the primary occupation? Are there trends in what the Ho-Chunk were bringing to be fixed? This was, again, at a time when the Ho-Chunk are dealing with the decline of the fur trade. So are you seeing items that they're bringing that relate to personal decoration, or are you seeing more of the hunting tools where they're, still holding on to those, those fur trade ways? Was this a repair clinic or a fabrication workshop? Were they coming here to get their things repaired or get new things made? What materials are being used? We see in the ledgers that they're getting iron. That doesn't necessarily answer all the questions about what's being used here. Again, same thing with coal, same thing with what they're burning. Why would the blacksmith have so much raw material? And again, where was the shop? We know roughly where it was. We got a little bit closer to figuring things out in the past couple weekends during the archaeology dig, but it remains a bit elusive. So it sounds like the archaeologists are interested in working again on the project this coming year. So as long as paperwork all works out with the state, it looks like we'll continue searching for some more answers. So, well, with that, any questions?
I've had a question asked of me when I'm giving a tour, and we have that, I was told this trade item that the Native Americans really love, and it's that hatchet, and it's also a pike. And now I'm assuming that the blacksmith made just the metal part, and then it was up to the Native Americans or the Ho-Chunk to make the wood pipe part?
Yeah, so to repeat that question for the camera, just because I have the microphone so people can hear, but anyway, we have a question about when you see a trade axe, a trade item, like a pipe axe with the pipe on one side, the axe on the other, and then it has the wooden handle. Was the blacksmith here to just make the metal part, or was he making both? And from what I understand, the blacksmith could have made both. He would have easily had access to some wood to make it. But if you look at the legacy of the fur trade, I would sort of think it would be up to the native, because when you're hauling these goods across, the Great Lakes, hauling a big supply of trade goods out to trade with the natives, you're going to want to save as much space as possible so you can get as much stuff with you as you can. So I'm pretty sure that they would have just had the axe heads, all put up in a crate, barrel, something, and then those handles could be fabricated on site. So that's at least what I understand, although I could be corrected on that. So.
And I kind of thought that too. And also a question that is asked when I talk about that, and that is, okay, this was a trade item. Does that mean that the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, whatever, were they then they traded furs and stuff for that, or was this something that the government made as a gift to them?
Yeah. So the question is, what, when somebody is receiving, I presume, a gift from the Indian agent, a thing like an axe that the blacksmith made, given to them as a gift, was this a trading situation, or was it a purely given, a gift-giving situation? And we have evidence that this was primarily a gift-giving situation. John had a specific line item in his budget where he would spend a very substantial sum of money just to buy gifts for the Ho-Chunk. You could call it a trade, because in Ho-Chunk culture, when you visit somebody, you bring a gift, and then the person you visit gives a gift back. So in that sense, the natives are giving something when they're also receiving something. But whether you call that a trade or whether you call that a formality, that's up for debate. So, yeah. Yes.
You alluded to that it was possibly seasonal. Do you have any idea what the season was?
Yeah. So the question is, this was I mentioned that this was a seasonal thing, and the question is, what season would people be visiting the blacksmith? Over the winter, the Ho-Chunk would be going off into scattered villages to maximize their ability to hunt. In the summer, they would come back to a larger village and grow crops, primarily corn. So from what we understand, the fall of the year was the main time you came to the agency. For people locally, if your trap broke in the middle of the winter, if something broke in early spring, if a hoe broke in the summer, you could probably just bring it up here, you know, on a very quick turnaround basis. But a lot of the people that this agency served were coming from a long distance, so the annuity payment, the money payment for the Ho-Chunk land was paid usually September, October, one time as late as November here. So it was usually in the fall of the year where the Ho-Chunk are looking toward this winter hunt, and they're coming here to get paid for their land, and it's a good time to also get their stuff done by the blacksmith. So
The blacksmith was here the entire year.
yes. Mm-hmm.
And who would have determined whether or not it was a repair versus a new? Is that the agent's discretion?
So the question is whether who determined whether this was a repair job or whether you make something new. And you know, I wish I had an answer to that. I've been trying to track that down, but we know the agent was heavily involved. So if anybody had to make that determination, I'm pretty positive it would have been an agent. So as to your point of when, you know, what time of year the blacksmiths would be here, an interesting side note is that during the Black Hawk War, things, of course, got pretty unsettled. There was a lot of worries that Black Hawk would be coming up to Fort Winnebago. The blacksmith assistant, along with pretty much all the civilian workers at the fort, you know, the civilians in this area, including Juliet Kinsey, they all fled up to Green Bay for the winter, or for that, till not the winter, the fall, to wait out the war. But the one civilian who's said to have remained was the blacksmith. So John stayed behind to meet with the Ho-Chunk as part of his job, but the blacksmith, either from just you know, non-concern, or whether it was because this was an important thing to continue, especially during the time of the year that this was happening, for some reason he was one of the very few who stayed. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Referring to your slide there, you allude to this next year's series. Oh, next year's series, but then those August events and September events are in 2020?
Yep, these are 2020 events. We have on August 8th to 9th, the Civil War Year 2, so 1862, is being represented by a living history reenactment. We're going to have it so that things are all safe with reenactors sort of cordoned off, where you can safely discuss with them, and we're very, very happy that that turned out, or is able to still go on this year. On August 29th, we have a guided history hike. There's a lot of history that happened on this property, so if you want to learn more about, you know, the people who came through here, you know, some of the different features on the property, we're leading a guided tour of that on the 29th. September 19th, we're having our 1830s era living history reenactment, emphasizing the different types of entertainment on the frontier. As long as I'm on the topic of this slide, I would also like to thank the Museum at the Portage again for coming with us to sponsor this event and to be able to put this event together. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you guys for coming.
Historic Indian Agency House, built in 1832. The Indian Agency House was built in 1832 by the United States government for John Harris Kinsey and his wife Juliet McGill Kinsey. John Kinsey was the Indian agent to the Ho-Chunk Winnebago Indians. He had been assigned by the government to protect the interests of the Ho-Chunk and pay them their stipend of silver. Juliet McGill Kinsey wrote Wabun, the early day in the Northwest, about her life at Fort Winnebago and the agency house. Wabun means early day in Anishinaabe, the Ojibwa language. Wabun includes sketches she made that depicted the Wisconsin landscape before the land rush by American and European settlers. Wabun is one of the most important records of the Northwest Territory. The site of Fort Winnebago was on the Moore Farm northeast of this site here in Portage across from the surgeon's quarters. The agency house cost $3,497.18 to build in 1832. Materials and labor came from long distances. Masons and carpenters came from St. Louis, Missouri, 718 miles away. Lime was burned at Pierre Paquette's farm, Bellefontaine, 12 miles north of this site here in Portage. Brick was made 2 miles away at the site of present-day Paquette Park in Portage. Part of the lumber came from Green Bay, and the rest was transported 70 to 80 miles down the Wisconsin River from the north. Finished doors probably were brought by ox team from Galena, Illinois. The National Society of Colonial Dames of America in the state of Wisconsin purchased the agency house in October 1931, restored it, and opened it to the public in 1932. The agency house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. And again, historic agency, Indian Agency House of Portage, Wisconsin.